a truly successful company in the long term, there have always been two jobs in business. We often simplify and think that it's about optimizing the performance of the company. But on long enough timescales, and though those timescales are compressing, there were always two jobs. One of them is to play the current game very effectively, play it more than your competitors, extract returns, drive efficiency. And you have to do that. Otherwise, you don't have the funds to pay for the future or the license to buy a different future. But you do have to have a different future because nothing lasts forever. So you also have to ask the second question, which is, what is the next game? And those games are not only somewhat contradictory, but they're actually very fundamentally different in nature. I'm Martin Reeves. I'm the chairman and the founder of the BCG Henderson Institute, which is BCG, the consulting company, BCG's think tank on new approaches to strategy and change and management. I'm originally a biologist. I'm a through and through generalist. I've always been interested in everything and knowing a little bit about everything and the connections between things. And I sort of banked my career on being able to deploy my skills as a generalist. And sometimes that felt like the wrong thing to have done. I felt like the last surviving generalist in a firm called specialist at some points in my career. But for better and probably worse, I'm the generalist that's interested fundamentally in using the mind to solve problems. We might call that strategy. We might call that consulting. We might call that innovation. But what am I doing? I'm basically saying, how do we think about that? What's the real question here?
Martin, maybe just as kind of an opening question for folks to calibrate, folks who are joining us and maybe don't know much about the Henderson Institute, would you talk for a second about BCG's Henderson Institute and the role it plays for the firm?
Yes. So my discipline is basically strategy, competitive strategy, and competitive strategy is actually a relatively young discipline. It was founded in the early 1960s on the East Coast of America. And one of the quirks of BCG's history is that our founder, Bruce Henderson, was one of the pioneers of the discipline of competitive strategy. And so the firm has its roots in strategy and also not just commercializing the discipline of strategy, but actually evolving and shaping the discipline of strategy. So that was informal. Essentially everybody in BCG at the very beginning was an originator of ideas and, a practitioner employing those ideas. But at a certain point in the history, we decided to formalize that by setting up the Institute. So the mission of the Institute is essentially to continue Henderson's legacy of shaping the discipline of strategy. We extended that to all of our offering because, it's been a long time since BCG ceased to be a pure strategy firm. And the mission is to inspire, so not just inform, but inspire the next game, not the current business and its performance, the next game of the thought leaders in business using the medium of ideas. So the key elements are essentially, inspiration on information, next game, the next set of ideas that we'll need, who to the practitioner thought leaders in business using in this age where, technology is important, change is important, sort of defending the traditional technology of ideas. So, that essentially is what we do.
You mentioned the word ideas several times there, which if you know anything about me and Henrik, we are lovers of ideas. How do you think about ideas in a world where we have this alien co-intelligence called artificial intelligence? How do you think about the nature of ideas and the dissemination of ideas and even the metabolism of ideas for us as humans?
Well, business, I think, with all of its pressures for short-term performance, is often in the mode of doing. But I think to do strategy effectively, and I define strategy as any systematic pattern of thought or action which leads to an increased probability of competitive advantage. So to do that job, you have to borrow a phrase from one of my collaborators. You have to think strategically about thinking strategically while behaving strategically. So there's a behavior layer, what you do, and you need to think about that behavioral layer strategically while still behaving. So that ideas layer, that thinking layer, is essentially thinking about framing, what's the problem? Because the problem, the question, the task to be addressed is rarely the one that's given, and there are, always infinite choices of how you frame a problem. It's partly about thinking how to address it, and the problem-solving methodology and sequence, and it's also about innovating new approaches to that. So that in itself, I think, is like an expansion of a execution and performance-oriented, narrow view of business. And then we have this new form of cognition in town. So one of the chapters in my book, The Imagination Machine, is called AI, artificial imagination. And it asks the question, will we ever have artificial imagination? And I think it's an interesting question because the experts early on in the AI revolution came out and said, well, there are certain things that AI will never be able to do, and they're the most human things. So imagination and ethics and empathy, essentially. Well, I'd say that we don't really need to speculate about that because we already have tools which potentiate and enhance human imagination. So, for any aspect of imagination, I can name a tool that already exists. I think the failing or the limit is more that we might use these tools not to their full potential or use them unimaginatively, but the tools to assist the human imagination already exist. In fact, in a clinical trial that some of my colleagues did, where we looked at a large sample of managers and consultants, we gave them different types of tasks. The innovative tasks were actually the ones where the combination of humans and AI were relatively better. And the tasks where AI plus humans were relatively worse were what you might call business problem solving, sort of, fuzzy logic, fuzzy data sets to solve a shop floor problem. Because AI is not particularly good at capturing the physics of the world, right? We just have the training data set is what people said on the internet about a certain problem, not, how to get things done in the real physical world. So absolutely, AI will play a major role in business imagination.
Also in ethics?
Ethics, well, I think the definitional limit is not, it's not a technical limit, it's a definitional limit of AI, is that essentially at the end of the day, what are we doing? We're serving human ends. And unless we turn into automatons where we cease to have ends, I mean, only humans can specify their own ends. What problem do I want to solve? What change do I wish to bring about in the world? And which ethical constraints do I wish to place on that? It's our ethics, it's our purpose. So that's where we need human intervention. Now, at a technical level, we could ask questions like, what would be some typical ethical issues with a solution like this? And get a fairly good survey. Again, it's a tool which can assist our ethics, but it can't replace our ethics. We get to decide what is right and wrong, and we get to decide what the purpose is. So I often laugh about the use of the word agent in AI, agentic AI. It's as if we are the objects and the agents are the artificial intelligence bots. But of course, we have to be the agents. Otherwise, we are the slaves of the AI agents.
Right. Right. We must be agentic. You referenced The Imagination Machine. It's one of my favorite books. It came out prior to ChatGPT, right? Was it 2021?
I think it was 2021 or 22. 21,
Okay.
I think.
So the chapter on artificial imagination was conceived prior to generative AI. What would you rewrite now that you've seen the impact of generative AI?
Well, I could write more. It was just one chapter, and the book wasn't mainly about that, so I could write more. Actually, the book didn't really dwell on. There's a whole literature on like what can the latest technology do right now. The technical performance of the AI. I didn't really deal with that. I dealt with more what is immutably true about imagination and technically what is possible, even if it's not the case today. So in that sense, I wouldn't change much. I think since writing the book, I've done a lot of thinking about AI and competitive advantage. So I would probably write more about that because I see a sort of a grave oversight in that respect in the world, which is that as we get enthusiastic about the technology and its technical possibilities, we forget that if those same technical possibilities are available to everybody, so if we all buy the Microsoft tool and it's trained on the same training data, and we're free to use it for any purpose our competitors are using it for, we haven't created competitive advantage. We may have created efficiency, but we've actually commoditized competitive advantage.
Right. There's just competitive parity. You could say that effective use is
And
parity.
that's a subtle thing, because if somebody gets a 15% productivity list by using new technology, you will be at a disadvantage if you don't do that too. But merely because you do that doesn't give you an advantage. So I've done a lot of thinking about with an academic strategist called Jay Barney at University of Utah about, well, do the two intersect? Can you have the efficiency gains and the competitive advantage? And the short answer is yes, but not automatically. And there are a
Yeah.
couple of routes to that. So one route, for example, is reinforce existing advantage. So if Amazon, with its advantages in logistical efficiency and IT systems integration and knowledge of customers, enhances that existing advantage with AI, that probably could be a durable advantage. There's a very hard path, which is serial temporary advantage, which is you can have an advantage for a while by using the latest technology to a new end and being further down the learning curve than your competitors. But that's a very hard path, because you have to stay ahead and you have to, hope that you don't stumble once, otherwise your competitors will overtake you. But I think the big area is, essentially competitive advantage is, if I grossly simplify, it's about doing difficult and valuable things which are hard to imitate. And one of the really difficult and hard and valuable things to do is to have an aligned group of people that are collectively effective. And I think the difficulty increases if if you introduce artificial intelligence into the mix. So if you imagine this, sort of bionic organization of the future, where we have um, creative uses of AI, seamless integration with humans and machines, alignment, partition of tasks, interfaces, and that's going to be as difficult to replicate as culture. So, I think that will be so the basis for advantage in the future. In that sense, maybe quite organizational, but what it absolutely isn't, and in spite of what you might believe if you read most of the literature on AI, is the mere deployment of the best and latest technology, because it's especially for this technology, because it moves very quickly. So, whatever you do, your competitor's probably going to leapfrog you more quickly than any other technology. And also because it was born open source. So AI is not entirely open source, but essentially you've got these large models, which they're multiple, they're rather similar, they use similar training data, and they're essentially available to anyone for a price. So it's really closer to a definition of commoditization than one of advantage.
Can I just do I see if I can compute it. There's so many interesting elements of what you say. So one thing though, that as like somebody who is like the practitioner, like somebody who's building companies every day, really interesting obviously of asking ourselves, what is it that I'm great at that AI can make me better at? Because then you get like the AI multiplier that you outlined. Could you touch a little bit though on, obviously AI as we know it right now is not easy to think about how to enhance my culture. But as you think about how do we design our organizations to be strategically aligned with the future that we're about to kind of get into, what is the organizational principles of that design? And also maybe how do that pertain to the culture that you create within it?
Well, you can ask the question without AI and then add it in, and I think you get to the same answer. But my book, The Imagination Machine, deals with imagination and advantage. And in order to have an effective imaginative organization, that is an organization which conceives of valuable things that are not the case and then causes them to become the case, counterfactual thinking, and then the conversion of those counterfactuals into facts. To do that effectively, you need a whole bunch of things to be true. You need people to be untethered to their current operating model, not to see everything in the world through the lens of their current model. So you need a certain mindful, flexibility. Secondly, you need the avoidance of complacency, because the backward-looking financial indicators may tell you things are fine, you're profitable, but that's very misleading. I think complacency in formally successful companies is a brake on innovation. I think it requires agility, because if you do discover a counterfactual possibility that is interesting, you have to be able to move quickly, and large objects have inertia. The corporations tend to change very slowly and to, on the whole, resist change. You have to have the optimal degree of alignment and diversity. You need enough diversity of thought to be able to see the ideas, but enough alignment to actually get them done. You need some sort of synchronization. If you're leaving a synchronized state to find a new synchronized state, you've got to sort of increase the noise level and then reconverge. So all of that is true, whether you're talking about humans or AI, and all of that is quite difficult. And in addition, if you're aligning two types of cognition, I think you've got to think about fitness for purpose. If your complicated AI models cease to be relevant or generate, untruthful outcomes, how would you know? When would you know? So there was famous financial collapses where, very sophisticated models, so sophisticated and complex that people didn't really understand at a granular level, exactly how they worked. And how would you continue to audit fitness for purpose? Ethical oversight, which is we can do that, but should we do that? Matching of partition of roles. So what do the humans do? What does the AI do? Maintenance of fitness. So even if it were the case that humans were substitutable to some extent, if we become pilots that depend on the computer and forget how to fly, that's not necessarily a good thing in the long term. So how do we have tapered integration so that the AI does largely what it's good at, we do largely what we're good at, but we maintain enough overlap that we don't atrophy our essential capabilities. Bandwidth matching, which is, humans can think more flexibly and subtly than an AI model. Humans are very good at meta thinking, thinking about strategically while thinking strategically while acting strategically, entertaining multiple perspectives and so on. But in terms of the amount and the complexity of information processed and finding, weak signals in enormous haystacks, the AI is better. So that's two very different types of data trying to communicate with each other. And I don't think we've figured out yet what those interfaces look like. So add all of that together, that would be, to coin a phrase, the bionically enhanced organization where cognition was not only deployed, but deployed to effectively for competitive advantage. And it would also be rather integrated. I think it's common that early in a technology revolution, the early applications are spot applications, a particular step of a particular process. Usually the things which are most tractable, the sort of easiest things. But this would have to be, for the organizational design as a whole. So to put it another way, when my kids use the word organization in the future, what will they mean? They'll probably mean something, I would guess, like what I just meant. Some effective cognitive hybrid of humans and machines. And it's hard enough just to get the human cognitive surplus working properly, the collective intelligence, let alone adding to that the mixture of cognitive technologies.
So if you sit and you run a company today, like all this obviously sounds very feasible and plausible. I guess the two questions that arise is one is, is this midterm, short term, long term? And secondly, what do I kind of change in my organizational design tomorrow? Like, do I still have a marketing team tomorrow? Like, do I still have HR? Like, or do I actually change something right now to kind of allow me to walk the path that you was
The thing about innovation is you never fully know the answer to that question. You learn your way towards that answer. So I guess that translates into a question of where are we? Are we at the stage where your question is the most important question, which is, we know most of what we need to know, and we have to now redesign our organizations. I think we don't. So some organizations are thinking, I think it's very early days, actually. I think it's, it's primarily B2C. There's a lot of noise about, B2B applications of AI, but, much less action, according to the numbers that I've looked at. And I'm not sure we've found the killer application. I think we've found the spot applications. I'm not sure that we've reconceived the enterprise yet, and I'm not sure how we know how to. But there's a bunch of companies out there thinking about that. So a bunch of companies thinking about things like cognitive elevation, which is how do we move the human cognition to higher and higher levels, to more and more sophisticated tasks, and have AI deal with more routine tasks. I think people are thinking about this issue of validation. We've already had a number of scandals where, in medicine, for example, where huge things were claimed of the AI. And since AI is not very traceable, it's very hard to say what's going on inside the model because it's an emergent property of a model. You don't program the specific connections for a specific problem. they emerge through a learning process. And so these scandals have been where a property was claimed and the models were too intransparent or complex to say, is it actually working? And we find out after the event that actually it didn't work very well. There was a lot of enthusiasm about it. There was dollars poured into it. There are dermatology applications, for example, that diagnose cancers that were thought to be, a miracle of visual recognition and disease classification. That turns out they don't actually work very well. And in medicine and many other areas, there are real consequences for that. So there are companies worrying about that validation, because we don't really have standards of validation. If I want to build an airplane, I have to comply with a certain, accident investigation protocol and some things we know about the design of the airplanes, safety. If I want to build a new drug, I have to do clinical trials, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials. What are those validation processes for AI applications? We don't know. So I think that, I think any company today needs to be thinking about these things. I'm not sure there are fully baked answers that they can adopt, but I think a good candidate would be, probably whole swathes of functional expertise may go away or transmute, because it's already the case that a large part of the traditional marketing department is now embedded in the algorithms of multi-sided market platforms. There have already been several AI revolutions, and we can learn from those. So one of them is in social media, the AI algorithms that shape your content feeds, and another one is in multi-sided marketplaces that recommend you the next product. So we already have algorithms that essentially do what marketing departments used to do, and do it at lower cost, at greater complexity, and at more quickly. So typically a traditional marketing department might do a 2x2 matrix, sort of 4 segments of customers, and may match products to different customer segments, and may have prices associated with those product variants that change every 6 months or every year. Well, we can now do that for every consumer individually with dynamic pricing.
It's a 2x2x2x2x2
at a lower cost.
Yeah.
So, some things about AI, we sort of ask, what's going to happen? And I think we're blind to the fact that, well, it already happened. There is history that we can learn from in these areas I've just been making. And also that it's actually proactive, which is, this is not a passive affair. The future depends on what we do. Are we going to focus on cost-cutting applications, revenue-enhancing applications, illegal and regulatory constraints first, or legal and regulatory constraints later? We get to decide.
That's actually ties perfectly into where I was curious to go is, I have 2 questions, and I'll ask the first and then the second. You had said earlier, use this phrase, I wrote it down. What's immutably true about imagination? Now I have somewhere that I want to go after that, but can you, for folks who don't know, or for folks like me who hear that phrase and it's catnip, what is immutably true about imagination? And then I have a follow-on as well.
Well, I think there are some things that are like very strong findings from my research on imagination, either scientific fact or, consistent observation. So I'd say one of the interesting paradoxes is that it's almost entirely a uniquely human trait. So the ability to think about things that are not the case, hypotheticals and counterfactuals, and then using our agency to make them the case, I think that's almost entirely human. And every 5-year-old can do that. But the paradox is that by default, it becomes extraordinarily hard for large collections of middle-aged people in companies to muster that skill that every 5-year-old has. So I think that's sort of...
Why is that? What's the hindrance?
I think companies start small and renegade. I mean, almost by definition, a small company, a new company, has no chance of succeeding in the world against incumbents unless it does something differently. There's no point in being, a very, very tiny version of Procter and Gamble. You've got to do something differently, different product, different business model. But once that business model has been found, for the survival and flourishing of the company, so that the investors get a return, that needs to be perfected and scaled. So essentially, you go from imagining and first realization to optimization and scaling. And in the process of optimization and scaling, you deploy the Adam Smith principle of the division of work, which is, you say, well, hang on, Jeremy can't do it all. Let's have a marketing department and a production department. So they they're already looking at parts of the company.
Mhm.
And if your company is still around for people to talk about, it will be very big, i.e. hard to change. It will be successful. Why would you walk away from something successful? Changing it would involve the realignment and the disturbance of a very well-established pattern of thought, the personal and corporate risk-taking that may seem unnecessary, a sense of urgency that may be lacking in a sort of a salaried, formerly and maybe even currently successful enterprise. So these are all barriers to collective imagination, complacency, scale, the mental bias of seeing things through the lens of your currently successful model, and the sheer complexity of changing the minds and actions of a large group of people. And then the other one is the cyclicality of imagination. I mean, it's always been the case that nothing lasts forever in business. And so we always had to not only imagine, but reimagine. It's just that the time scales of the reimagination were usually longer than a managerial career. So the next CEO could think about the reimagination of the company. I'm just going to focus on optimizing total shareholder return.
I love that.
But whereas today, it's not the case. I mean, we can
Mhm.
show there's something called the advantage decay curve, which is the rate at which competitive advantage, the relative performance differential compared to competitors fades. And that used to be roughly 10 years across industries, and it's now roughly a year. So the world is moving 10 times faster with respect to competitive advantage. So what does that mean? That means every large company, difficult though it is, needs to have that sort of startup mentality.
Okay. Okay. So this perfectly dovetails into my follow-up question, which is you said earlier, everyone misunderstands AI and competitive advantage, or at least rather there's been an oversight. And you spoke about how you are disadvantaged if you fail to accumulate the efficiency gains available today, but you aren't advantaged if you do. So here's necessarily if you do. So here's my hypothesis, and it's actually founded in something that you wrote years ago. One of the kind of seminal quotes I remember ever reading in my life, I attribute to you. I don't know if you wrote it or one of your colleagues did, but it's got your name on it. But you said, the imagination is sparked by unexpected input.
Yeah, no, that's a major part of the imagination machine.
So here's my hypothesis that I would love for you to
Yeah,
react to. While achieving efficiency gains doesn't ultimately result in competitive advantage, it is a necessary precondition because it's what sparks imaginations of how to achieve competitive advantage.
right. Well, I think this is a very interesting subject, and it goes to the heart about what is difficult and valuable and hard to replicate about both exploration and exploitation. So a truly successful company in the long term, there have always been two jobs in business. We often simplify and think that it's about optimizing the performance of the company. But on long enough timescales, and though those timescales are compressing, there were always two jobs. One of them is to play the current game very effectively, play it more than your competitors, extract returns, drive efficiency. Um, and you have to do that. Otherwise, you don't have the funds to pay for the future or the license to buy a different future. But you do have to have a different future because nothing lasts forever. So you also have to ask the second question, which is, what is the next game? And those games are not only somewhat contradictory, but they're actually very fundamentally different in nature. The mental procedures and the capabilities of optimization and exploitation of the current model are things like analysis, incremental learning, deduction analysis. So relatively, it may be hard in its own way. It may be hard to find the next 5% of efficiency, but you're dealing with data and well-established patterns. Innovation, on the other hand, and this is a topic of my latest book, like the button that changed the world, is very serendipitous. I mean, we never know. We may set out with an intention to find, as in the case of Sir Alexander Graham Bell, to find a multiplex telegraph, and we may accidentally discover the telephone. And we may have a certain vision of how the telephone would change the world, and usually it turns out to be completely wrong. What that useful thing does has far-reaching serendipitous ramifications. So this sort of double game of what the strategists call strategic ambidexterity,
Yeah.
exploring while exploiting, involves very different mindsets and very different skills.
Is what you're getting at here, just to cut to the
Yeah.
chase a little bit, is what you're getting at that the people who are responsible for playing the current game effectively have difficulty thinking of what the next game is? Is that, and so my hypothesis that achieving efficiency gains are necessary to unlocking actual durable competitive advantage. The problem with my hypothesis is you're saying, I think, those same brains that are good at playing the current game may not be the brains that you
Yeah,
can
and
get.
it's not entirely true, but it's probably mostly true. So in other
Yeah.
words, um, so we have my first book, Your Strategy Needs a Strategy. I looked at 5 species of strategy. The big idea in the book was for different types of situations, you actually need different fundamental approaches to strategy. Visionary, classical, adaptive, and so on. There are fundamentally different approaches to strategy. And we actually created a game using a sort of a form of artificial intelligence, if you will. It uses as something called a population of multi-armed bandit algorithms to simulate any strategic situation. And then we had thousands of people playing this game over the years. So we're able to collect data on what type of strategy problems are people good at. And it turns out that there are about 3% of people that are good at both the innovation game and the optimization game, but not a lot. And
Hmm.
why? Because they're fundamentally different skills. So if you want to do both of these things, you have to do some subtle things. You got to hire different types of people. You got to have them get along with each other. You've got to balance the approaches. You've got to have teams that incorporate both components. You've got to make choices like, do I try really hard to hire ambidextrous leaders, or do I hire people that are skilled in one or the other discipline and artfully combine them? Or do I sequence them in time, saying, well, right now we need to focus on optimization, and then I, you know, change the people as the business progresses and match the skills to the situation. So that is the hard part about dynamic strategy, which is this change from exploration to exploitation, and then self-disruption or disruption from without, going back to exploration, needs to occur continuously, and that's a rather hard thing. And in competitive strategy, that's rather a good thing that is hard, because therefore it basis for competitive advantage.
So then how do you, okay, so I agree, or I really appreciate that thought that training your existing workforce to derive efficiency gains is insufficient to discovering a new competitive advantage because so few of those people are capable of doing both. So let's take that as a given, even though perhaps we could discover it more. How does an organization structurally discover the next horizon of competitive advantage if its current employee base is likely, you could say, for lack of a better word, incapable of imagining it themselves?
Well, I think that question is equivalent to, how do you harness serendipity? We know that serendipity is not the same thing as randomness, but we also know that it's extraordinarily difficult to predict. It's hard to predict innovation. So how do you enhance the power of serendipity in an organization? I think you can do it in a number of ways. I mean, I think you can expose the organization to heterogeneity. So an externally oriented organization is less likely to breathe in its own smoke and more likely to see something that doesn't fit, some anomaly that stimulates thought externally. So external orientation is one way. Hiring for cognitive diversity is another. Have different minds that are capable of looking at the same situation and coming up with different solutions. Having a culture that says, well, that's actually valuable. The fact that we're not completely aligned, we agree to be aligned for the large part on the core business model, but in the new areas, we deliberately unaligned, where we're exploring. Not many cultures can do that. That's another thing you can do. You can train people. So as part of the Imagination Machine book, I spent some time looking at educational systems, and my big question was, we're trained in all sorts of thought in our many different styles of thought in our educations, right? We're trained in deductive thought and analytical thought. But in terms of counterfactual thinking, the only training that I received was, freestyle drawing and role play in kindergarten. Beyond that, I didn't receive any formal education in the art of counterfactual thinking. But you can train people to do things like mine analogies. What is this like? Multiple working hypotheses, which is, we could look at it this way, we could look at it this way. To discriminate between the facts and choices of mental model. Often we'll say something like, I have a 2% share of the pharmaceutical industry. This is a fact. Well, it's not a fact. It depends on how you frame the borders of the pharmaceutical industry and what you regard as, within the share versus, some other activity. It's a mental choice. And so, but you can train people to question assumptions and discriminate between facts and mental models. You can have people that are skilled in deliberately manipulating the degree of divergence within a meeting, making choices. This is a meeting where
Devil's advocacy, red teaming, things
but
like
but
that.
also like the choice of what is this meeting for? Is this meeting to optimize, or is this meeting to actually to question and challenge? And how do we do that? And you can train people in that. I mean, I was fortunate to receive training in de Bono's 6 thinking hats approach, which essentially is choicefulness about different styles of thinking and
Yeah.
deliberate agreement amongst a group of people on which ones to deploy. So there's a whole bunch of things that you can do to up your odds of being able to deploy collective imagination.
You guys done a lot of research in the use of AI in organizations. You mentioned when we started the conversation that some things a person with AI was better at than other things that a person in AI was. What are some of the other kind of like results of that kind of research that let people kind of like understand if they were to allocate time and resources against some use of AI? Where are there good putts to be? Where's their good hunting grounds?
I think the initial view was this view. So Kai-Fu Lee, when he wrote his book, one of the early books by a true AI expert on what will AI be able to do and what won't it be able to do, essentially asserted this extremely plausible hypothesis that it was about ethics and empathy and imagination. Those were the things, the human bastions that would, survive challenge from AI's substitutability by AI. I think we discovered that that's not the case with imagination because we can have these aids to imagination. And I think this actually mirrors a more general thought, which is um, in my book, I looked at the detailed evolution of the like button, this recognition tool that creates a currency of recognition that enabled the targeting of user feeds, that enabled a different type of advertising proposition, and therefore permitted the takeoff of the social media industry and triggered the disruption of the marketing and advertising industry. And one of the really interesting things when I interview these pioneer companies of the invention of the like button is that none of the pioneers of the like button foresaw the eventual evolution of the like button. And so it's natural that in the early stages of the technology revolution, we turn to the experts, the people that either purport to know something about the new technology or actually seem to because they worked for Google or they had, esteemed jobs or professorships or whatever. But the track record of experts early in technology revolutions is pretty disastrous, actually. You'd be better off questioning than assuming.
Isn't that to your other point of like somebody who was trying to come up with a better telegraph came up with a telephone? A lot of the time, the score kind of like take care of itself, but often not where you
Right.
expect it to.
So I think we're discovering, and I think, part of innovation is looking for the unexpected. And competitive strategy, if you ask me what is generally true of the world, I could make some assertions. For instance, my wife yesterday was looking for a some sort of portable Wi-Fi device for the car because one of my daughters has a long trip every week and she has to do her homework in the car, so she needs internet connection. And we speculated, wouldn't it be great if you could combine a hard disk drive with a battery pack, with a MiFi, with a router? Like, why couldn't you put that all in one package? Because right now you have to buy the different pieces separately. And so I thought it was a really interesting discussion because we could say that, well, is that generally going to be an easy thing to do? No, that's pretty hard. It's going to be hard to get all of those devices into one box. But the thing about competitive strategy is it doesn't deal with what is generally true. It deals with the ability to create the exception. Strategy is all about exceptions. If you do the things which are generally true of your, what your competitors do, you would be probably, you wouldn't exist, or at best you'd be, one of a number of commodities in your sector. I think devil's advocate thinking, I think saying, yes, it's going to be generally hard for AI to do ethics, but what can we do with AI and ethics? And how could we support human ethics? And looking for exceptions, looking for analogies in other spheres. I think that's one thing I could say. I think in terms of judging what is going to be generally hard and what isn't, though, I think, and this is my speculation, I think the training data is a good clue, isn't it? Which is, what is the AI being trained on? The AI is being trained on speech acts, what people say about something in large swathes of textual data. It's not trained on the physics of the world. The closest it gets to, if I push this object, it's going to move, or it isn't going to move, or it's um, the closest you can get is what people say about the physics of the world. But what people say about the physics of the world and actually getting things to happen, the social physics and the actual physics, it's probably going to be hard to do actual physics. I think, there are certain areas where you can ask yourself the question, what is not in the training data? So that's not in the training data. There are going to be dominant themes, right? If you pick something that's very old, for instance, I was doing some research the other day on the very old discipline, which came out of the military, of operations research. So a particular form of problem solving that was pioneered before powerful digital computers to assist with military problems, like finding downed pilots in, vast swathes of the ocean or whatever. Because it's a very old subject and now a very obscure subject, the AI couldn't find it. The AI cannot tell you about your own intention, right? What is my purpose here? Your purpose is, you get to decide. Some things are not immutable facts. They are choices made by human beings with their choicefulness and their agency. Now, the question is, what do you do with those signals of difficulty or ease? You're asking, where should I choose to deploy the AI? Well, you can look at it one of two ways, right? You could say, well, I don't want to be stuck funding something that's going to be very difficult because I might run out of money. So I'm going to go for a feasible application. Or you could go the other way and say, well, precisely because it's hard and it's never been done before, there might be a very big prize associated with that. And that's always a tension in competitive strategy. And that's a difficult, fuzzy managerial calculation because there's no data on what doesn't yet exist. So you learn your way to the right balance. So that's where a lot of art and fuzzy logic and human judgment comes in. Because what you can't do on AI is say, look at the population of all things that don't exist and assign a probability to them. It just can't be done. Or what you can say is, let me learn my way to the future with choices that combine
Yeah, I was
properties
going
in
to
the
say,
right sequence.
neither can humans, right? And what innovators do is they create data through deploying prototypes and experiments. And I do think actually, I've been working with organizations that are creating, for example, synthetic audiences, and all of a sudden, if you can replicate 1 million users' decisions, you can actually almost Monte Carlo simulate what a population will do. And so all of a sudden, the cost of creating data is coming down multiple orders of magnitude.
I think my final question is, how do you use AI kind of on an everyday basis?
So what I've discovered, so I often do rapid exploration, rapid landscaping with AI. So if I'm beginning to think in a certain area, I ask the broadest questions I can. And the thing that really takes time in getting to know a new area is the really broad questions, like, historically, where did the current perspective come from? And, what are the different schools of thought in this area? How does this discipline interact with this discipline? And what are 20 examples of the thing that you're studying? And so I do rapid exploration. What I found and this may change over time, what I found with the current technologies, GPT-5 and the Grok and, all of the latest models, is that when I really know an area quite deeply, the results I get are, one, alarmingly fallible. Like in detail, there's a lot of things that are not right and not true. And secondly, that it really does depend on what people are calling prompt engineering, as if there is a formula for asking the right questions. But that was always the most important question in strategy, which is, what's the question? And I used to have, when I had a PC in my office, now everybody has sort of laptops. I used to have a pinned on my PC, like the best questions, the questions I would use every day. And it was a reminder, the sticky note was to remind me to ask certain questions. And one of the questions was, what's the real question? Because things present themselves as a problem, right? The CEO says, please help me to do a 15% cost reduction. But unless you ask, yeah, but what's the real problem here? Like, why would you want to do that? You don't get to the best framing of the problem. Another one of those questions was, the divergent question of what is that an example of? Okay, that question, that sort of subject is an example of some larger, edifice of learning. What is that? And then the convergent question, which is, give me an example of that. What is an example of that? What is that an example of? Give me an example of that. Another one of these questions was, what are the best questions? The question, what are the best questions? Because sometimes I'm normally in a consulting assignment or an innovation project. You don't know any answers. You may think you do, but generally things pan out that you don't. But what you can have is questions that force you to explore and bump into the surprises that trigger
Yeah.
the imagination. And there's very firm research on that essentially the human mind is an anomaly detection machine, and we detect. It's like the pictures the kids look at, spot 5 differences between these two versions of a drawing. We're extraordinarily good at that, and that's what triggers the
The question there is,
information.
do we dismiss the outlier or do we give it valence, right? And I think the tendency of the expert is probably to dismiss. The tendency of the novice or the beginner's mind is to give valence to the anomaly.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure whether in your area, imagination plays an important role. I'm not sure whether you do this, but I often learn from people that know nothing about the subject, because
Yeah.
by personally being forced to ask a question of somebody that knows nothing about a subject forces me to frame it in common language terms. And if you describe, market share in anti-cancer drugs without using the word market share or anti-cancer drugs, it really forces you to think a lot about the language. I'll often there's a lot of hidden assumptions in the words we use, and then also
Yeah.
the reply from your kids that begins, "Well, I know nothing about that, but," often gives you a left field, an imaginative response that, upon reflection, often has an interesting imaginative seed to amplify into. I think today's conversation is really interesting. It feels to me like essentially we've explored the underlying capabilities of purposeful human thought in many different areas. The surface questions are, what can the AI do? How do organizations work? How can you be ambidextrous? How do you innovate? But actually, it all boils down to, in the first instance, how do you think effectively about those sorts of problems? And that's one of the common threads in strategy. Like in the deep substratum is, how should we think about that? The question, how should we think about that?
I wanted to end our discussion, Martin, because you are a think tank at a consulting firm whose job is to think about what's the next game. We'd be remiss if we didn't ask you, if you think about where consulting is as an industry now, what's the next game for consulting, given the emergence of generative AI and given that proficiency among consultants is insufficient for durable competitive advantage? What's the next game?
Well, I think consulting as a business is one thing I'd say. So that business has to renew itself. And so we're in the midst of a technology disruption. So can AI write PowerPoint slides? Yes. Can it perform difficult calculations? Yes. Can it find weak signals? Yes. So obviously something will change. And by the way, it has been changing. So I remember my first project in 1989 when I joined BCG it sounds absurd now because there would never be a project like this. It was to calculate the size of the European automotive spring market. So the real springs in your doors, you know, in your carburetors, in your
That's a
radio.
classic case study interview question, isn't it?
Right. And actually the statistics didn't exist, which is precisely why somebody thinking of going into that space wanted us to have the answer to that question. So we had to interview in order to calibrate a model. We had to build a model of the industry. And you never do that now because data exists for most things, and that data is traded and monetized. Um, and I could give you many other examples. So, we have, for instance, the advent of personal computers. Early in my career, I went to the Tokyo office, and Japanese word processors, they existed, but they were incredibly cumbersome. Um, so the best was I think a program called WordStar, and it was incredibly complicated. You had to do shortcuts of like Control C plus Y to print or something, and would never do Japanese. So actually, the accountant Nakamura-san, he hand drew the slides with calligraphy. It's true. And so you could never redo a slide because he would refuse.
He's
Um,
sleeping.
and you could never
Reviewing some-
have more than 20 slides in the deck because it was too much for the calligrapher. And so that changed, obviously. So AI will change things, and we have to be open to change. What's different this time? What's different this time is it's faster moving, and bigger units of capex involved, probably. So if I'm hiring different types of people, that's easy, right? I just hire a specialist with a particular type of skill. If I have to build a computer network or a large database or something, more money involved, higher stakes. And also, we're at that stage where we don't really know. I mean, we expect great things. We're in the exuberance phase of technology, but there have been previous exuberance phases of artificial intelligence. And I remember when the DEC, the Digital Equipment Corporation, I think it was in the 80s, had a machine learning tools that simplified procurement, were able to automate your procurement. And everybody thought this was going to take over the world. But I think all of the companies involved in that revolution, and about 100 or so startups around that theme, they all disappeared within 10 years. So we don't know the future, and we're precisely at that stage now. But the second thing I'd say is the skills probably change, and they're already changing. So you need probably to be less. Historically, we hired generalists, and then as clients became more demanding in different industries, we started to hire specialists in particular industries, and we train specialists. Now we need technology specialists, but we also need a new type of generalist that is able to think deeply enough to question technologies. And a lot about the deployment of the technology is more about sociology and anthropology and the design of human systems. So it's almost like we need a barbell model. We need more emphasis on human skills and the specialties around that, and more emphasis on technology skills. So already my company, and I think most of the consulting companies, are hiring for those new skills. I think we need to experiment. I mean, there was a phase when our business, like many other businesses, was like a comfortable optimization and growth game. Not necessarily easy, but it was mostly a case of more and better. Whereas
Exploit.
now we're bumping into different, right? Which is,
Yeah.
well, what is an assignment? How do you have deep technologists, sort of like programmers and anthropologists in the same team, and they know how to talk to each other? And how do you deploy that? How does that work? That's a new, that's a new organization model. So in short, I think consultants will be forced, like other industries, to adapt and experiment and learn with what seems like an inevitable disruption. And those times of disruption are when number twos become number ones become number threes, or they disappear entirely. So it's a high beta game. The chances of something bad or good happening to you, the competitive volatility increases. So as a strategist, strategists have this rather perverse behavior of like rubbing their hands in interesting times. So that sounds like difficult times, if you're the CEO of a consulting company. But for me, that sounds like really interesting times.
It's brilliant. That's a perfect place to end, actually.
That's awesome.
Thank you, Mark.
Jeremy, that was so fascinating. A lot of stuff compacted into this, huh?
It felt like a dog years conversation where it's going to take me a longer time to unpack it than I was able to do in real time. One thing that I'm just kind of reflecting on at this very moment is this idea that prompt engineering is fundamentally a strategy tactic. He said at the end, the biggest thing in strategy is what's the question. And prompt engineering, obviously, it's what's the question. I think I never really thought about prompting as a strategy tactic, but I do believe that I've observed and I've experienced with, everyone I've ever worked with and taught, the quality of your output is directly a function of the quality of your input with AI and with strategy as well. And so I'm dismissive oftentimes of conversations about prompt engineering because it sounds too technical or something like that. Like I don't like even the whole craft or the whole art of it. I think there's something distasteful about it. And yet when you frame it in terms of a tactic for better strategy, all of a sudden it kind of casts it in this totally different light, which I thought was
Totally.
pretty
And I think maybe even to bring that home, the thing that he was saying also at the end, where one of the questions that he normally had on his PC as like questions he would ask was, what's the real question?
Mhm.
you would never imagine GPT-5 coming back to that, right? When you're saying like, hey, can you tell me like what this and this is? Like, could you imagine GPT come back and like, yeah, but what are you really asking
Right.
about?
Right.
Um, and I think, like what you're saying there is like, that basically is something you have to pre-bake into the
Right.
question that you're posing, right? That is the
Right.
strategy.
You have to think about your thinking. It reminded me a lot of our conversation with Stephen Kosslin, the dean at Harvard, because it's really a metacognitive. I mean, his whole book is called "Your Strategy Needs a Strategy." Right? He
Yeah.
talks about, so he's thinking about thinking, and I think there, what's interesting, Henrik, is you said GPT-5 would never do that, but you say dot dot dot, unless your custom instructions say always ask me what's the real question, and then all of a sudden you have a cognitive prosthetic, a cognitive brain testosterone that always reminds you of the most important thing, which is fascinating.
Which lead me to like, I think one of my observation was he talked about like basically innovation or originality or, like imagination, ethics and empathy were the three things that some of his, like some of the things that in the initial point of AI conversations, we were kind of getting to that would be difficult for humans to do. And I think he made like obviously the compelling point that, yeah, but like the AI tools can be very kind of like great assistance in kind of those three areas, probably. Like even ethics, like it could probably help you think about what your ethics are.
For sure.
Um, but what is also underlying is that, yes, but it is like the human end, as he always has pointed out. Like those
Uh,
are all
uh,
things that at the end of the day, nobody else will be able to answer really than you. Like, what is your idea of a new idea? What is your idea of what's right and wrong? What is your idea of what somebody else might think? And so, yeah, I think what he's articulating is that it's not like necessarily a binary, like what can humans still be good at? It is that the technology kind of will be used for everything, but there are
yeah.
some things where the human end is the end.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I found fascinating, I'm just kind of riffing here on stuff that stood out. Um, One statement, the track record of experts is very bad in regard to new technologies. And the fact that someone's an expert, say in AI, you and I, experts in AI, right? Do we have a humility as we approach this transformation? We're very bad at predicting where it's going to go. I think there's an intellectual humility there that I find refreshing and also challenging, because I know you get asked questions a lot. I get asked questions a lot. And I think there's a real pressure when you get asked a question to have an answer, you know, and the last thing you want to say is, I don't know. And yet, some of these predictions of technologists of the past look, patently absurd and ridiculous, specifically because they were unwilling to admit how little they knew.
Mm, yeah. The other thing that stood out to me was the simple question I'm still kind of framing in the context of how do you get a competitive advantage or how do you stand out either as an individual or as a company? And I think the simple question of what is not in the training data is an interesting kind of thought, right? And then the next one,
Right.
of course, like what do you have as an organization or as an individual that you might be able to add either in your problems or in your question or in your decision making around this that will keep you competitive. I think that is an interesting kind of thought process that I'm probably going to bring along for the next few weeks.
I mean, one kind of stat which I found great, from the game associated with your strategy needs a strategy. Only 3% of players were good at the double game, the ambidexterity. Just recognizing that, because I do think in so many cases, the job of imagining what's next for an organization is given to people who are good at the current game.
Yeah, the only
And
thing I
if,
would say to that, it's obviously complicated, right? When you then actually sit in it, because I think a lot of companies realize that hey, this might become actually that's not true. I think some companies definitely do not understand that they probably don't have the answer. Um, some people do, but I think the question that is obviously being posed to a CEO or head of innovation is like, yeah, that's great, but we have to do something tomorrow. We can't just be pondering. And I think
right.
then maybe then the whole thing come back to experimentation and then trying to figure out like how do we experiment as cheaply as possible so that you can afford quite a lot of shots on goal.
So many of these conversations come back to this idea of culture of experimentation, don't they?
they do a lot, but what I can't figure out is that is just kind of like an easy out. Right? Like, what are we gonna do? We have no idea. Let's just try shit. And you kind of go like,
Right.
yeah, but like it would be ideally you can try shit that has some directionality of success. Or at least like you had a reason for trying that specific thing. And so I'm a little bit kind of like torn between the yes, we actually need to build a new operational model for a lot of these companies because you got to have generalists that have the ability to try a lot and kind of, I think he was talking about taking imagination into something actionable. But how you actually do that is something that I'm not necessarily sure that we get wiser on when people say, hey, you should experiment more.
I think to your point, Henrik, insofar as experiment is code for be willy-nilly, or, and what I hate, by the way, is when people ex post rationalize something as an experiment. Oh, we were just experimenting, right? But that being said, I do think if an experiment is deployed scientifically, as you
Hmm.
said, purposefully with directionality, I think the danger is we don't want to do anything willy-nilly. So we don't do anything half-baked or without full knowledge of how it's going to go.
Yeah.
And I would say a negative adverse reaction to kind of the wrong framing of the experiment will lead many organizations to therefore not
I
experiment
think
at
that's
all.
very fair. And I'm really
And the
thinking,
last
this is something that I took back from, the Acorn method, my last book about entrepreneurship in organizations, which had nothing to do with AI. But I think it was similar in like, it is really, I think the best way to reduce the risk is to reduce the cost. And
Mm,
so a lot of time, the issue I think in an organization becomes that there's not a lot of room for origination. There's honestly often not a lot of new ideas. And once one materialize, it becomes the idea that then
right,
everybody's
exactly.
chasing, and then everybody's compounding stuff onto that idea because finally there's something new that is
Right.
seemingly getting approved, and then it has to work, right?
It's
Because
like
like
the
then,
reconciliation bill, not to go political, but it's like everything's got to be stuffed in this one thing rather
yeah.
than just being a spelled, simple, straightforward
And
experiment.
so it, yeah, like and then, it has to work, and then people get nervous, and then when people get nervous, they get back to what they know, like, and so therefore, like, you end up with something that's actually not that much of a new idea anyways, because like you
Wow.
kind of can't have it fail. And so how you get into the habit of like the hundreds to thousands of experiments, and that is maybe something that we should figure out. How do you become better at? Obviously, that's part of your world.
Two questions that I find are very helpful for leaders. One is, what are we trying? And the emphasis there is on the word trying. We don't know it's going to work, right? Try implies you don't know, a lack of certainty. And then the second question, you ready for it? What else are we trying?
Hmm.
Because then that implies options, that implies volume, it implies parallelization, it implies potentially duplication of effort. I think if a leader would be comfortable asking, what are we trying? And what else are we trying? That would unleash a lot more experimentation.
Mm, I like that a lot. The last thing I picked up on the conversation, all these wrote down, was what am I great at that AI can make me even better at? And I think
Mm,
it kind of goes back to fundamental questions that a lot of companies don't really ask themselves is obviously, who do I serve? What's the problem am I solving for those people? A lot of people just define themselves for what they do, right? Like I'm a media company, but that's not
right.
really, you know, your customer don't care. Um, but I think increasingly then it's like, am I actually look inwards? And I look like not just in kind of like what I make my money on, but what do I think the organization is really good at? Like, where do I have a culture of excellence? For example, at Bark, we're very good at supply chain. Like, people see us being a creative kind of products for dogs brand, but we're very good at our supply chain. And so like when you then look at AI and saying, like, hey, I need to have an advantage. Everybody else will have access to GPT-5. So like, how do I not just take and make it my success metrics that everybody's using GPT-5 because everybody's going to use this GPT or whatever model they use. Then what can I do where I'll be able to kind of like magnify the impact that AI can have?
Mm.
That's sort of an interesting question in my mind.
Or if you think about it as a multiplier,
Mm,
going back almost to our conversation with Nicholas Thompson, right?
yeah.
About what are your unwired capabilities? What a different, and for folks who haven't listened to that episode, the basic premise was your unwired human capabilities still matter because AI is a multiplier. And if, and say the multiple is 10, if you bench 20 pounds, then now you can bench 200, right? But if you can bench 200, now you can bench 2000. I think another way to think about unwired capability by the multiplier of AI is to say, what am I great at? Or effectively ask yourself the question, which muscle set can lift more weight than others, right? Is it my supply chain? Like, do we have a deadlift of 900 in our supply chain? Great. Then the deadlift is actually worth amplifying with AI, right? That's an interesting kind of assessment criteria there.
Maybe that's actually like one of the questions that, or one of the answers that we should give people when they ask us, like, where should I go and try to implement AI? I think historically I've said like where you feel there's like basically bright spots where you have organizational kind of like pull. But another one we say like, where are you already really good? Like
Excellence. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah, that's cool.
let's wrap it.
Folks, if you enjoyed this episode, if you would like more big thinking from Henrik Wordlund and Jeremy, please hit like, subscribe, share with your neighbor, share with your kids, share with your grandparent, share with your dog, Jaxie. And until next time.
Bye.